Today we're going to talk about the outgrowth from the Second Great Awakening during the early Republic era of America, and that is the Holiness movement. We're going to focus first on the work of the father of the Holiness movement, that of Finney, and then the mother of the Holiness movement, Palmer. It's only when we understand these two and their ministries and what the notion of the holiness movement is that we can understand the later growth of things like fundamentalism, Pentecostalism, the camp movement gets recontextualized underneath them, and we understand too the sort of move towards evangelicalism in America and what that looks like and how that doesn't fit precisely or neatly into the denominational structures that we saw during the colonial era or later.
What is it to be good? What makes something good? And is that always the same? Is the same thing always good? Or can too much of a good thing be bad? And what role does culture also have in determining what is, quote, good? The holiness movement was a movement largely to determine what was good, and to some extent to show people that you yourself are personally good and to reconnect what is good. The loose living that Edwards criticized in Puritan New England was the fuel for the First Great Awakening and became the fire of the American holiness movement. Like so many of the revivals during the 19th century, the holiness movement grew out of the burned over district of New York and camp meetings on the frontier. The father of the holiness movement, Charles Grandison Finney, was arguably the most impactful ordained American preacher in the 19th century. Finney's greatest preaching rivals, that of Phoebe Palmer and Dwight Moody, were both not ordained, and Billy Sunday was not ordained until the 20th century. On August 29, 1792, Charles Grandison Finney was born in Connecticut, but spent most of his young life in the already burning over district of New York. When Charles was 2, his family moved to Oneida County. Charles called this area of New York a wilderness and thought the area was still largely unsettled. The real wilderness, though, for Charles was the Finney home. Charles was the youngest of 7 children to Sylvester and Rebecca Finney. While Sylvester and Rebecca attended church semi-regularly, they were not particularly devout, and in his autobiography, Charles argued that neither of my parents were professing Christians, and among our neighbors there were very few religious people. I seldom heard a sermon, which is interesting given the total number of churches and sects that grew up in this very area. Likely Charles overstated his lack of religious upbringing in order to demonstrate a greater shift with his conversion experience, as many did in their spiritual autobiographies. This was still an essential practice to demonstrate that you are a real Christian, and that you would have something rather important for many Congregationalists still rooted in conservative Connecticut circles. It is known that one of Charles's older brothers was also ordained, though he never engendered the level of notoriety that Charles developed. In his autobiography, Finney maintains that the first praying community he found himself a part of was during his high school years in New England. Still, he didn't look very highly upon those New England Christians, believing them to be insincere in their praise of God. Charles' plans for his future focused on the law and was advised not to go to Yale but to study on his own. Largely, this was for financial reasons and time, that going to Yale would have cost too much and taken too long. In his private studies, Finney found that many older authors quoted scripture and referenced portions of the Mosaic Law as the source for religious authority. This prompted Finney to purchase a Bible for the first time in his life, and he read it for legal reasons, not for devotional ones. Before too long, Finney found himself as a part of the Second Great Awakening, swept up in one of the revivals. Finney attempted to pray, but felt that he was rejected by God. After attending a revival meeting in the fall of 1821, Finney sought to understand what God required of him. He then headed out into the woods to pray alone. It was here that he had his conversion, and he broke down in tears. He says that as he wept, he was filled with joy and love, and Finney recalls that the waves of joy continued to pass over him to the point that he believed that he would die from them. He felt his heart had turned to all liquid, and he called this his first spiritual baptism. It was after this that he abandoned the law to become a preacher. Finney began preaching 2 years before his ordination. In the spring of 1822, Finney began his theological training with the Presbyterians. Once ordained, he officially began his preaching career with campaigns in the already burned-over district of New York. These campaigns officially lasted for a dozen years, ending in 1834. It was here that his influence was at its zenith. His sermons were spellbinding, as he instituted what became known as the New Measures. This was somewhat formulaic, but still rather personal and used to great effect. Finney's New Measures began with him recounting his own conversion. From here, he litigated the case for Christ. His training as a lawyer was used not as in a courtroom, but in churches, barns, fields, and in tents. Intermixed with his salvation suit, Finney interjected personal examples from those who attended, private prayers, personal conversations, and songs. All of this was done without the aid of a printed sermon. All of the revival meetings usually lasted a few days, and his sermons, intermixed with hymns and testimonials, lasted about 2 hours each day during this revival. Probably the most notable feature of this new style for Finney's innovation was the anxious bench. The anxious bench grew out of a revival in Rochester, New York, where Finney called for anyone who's in attendance who would give their hearts to God to come forward and to take a seat in the first few rows. This seat were for those who were, quote, anxious for their souls, and resembled what would be found in many other churches as an altar call, especially those growing out of this movement or in other denominations, where those who sought salvation would come and receive special prayer. They also received focused attention by Finney himself. Finney believed that quite individual attention was more fruitful than loud, bolstering sermons preaching death and damnation. Here we see a radical change from the sort of sermons of Whitefield and Edwards and those of what Finney is doing, even though there was still this appeal towards emotionalism. Finney urged those who sought salvation to come to a decision very quickly. No time could be lost, and no assurance of tomorrow could be given. Only the sinner can change the course of their life, and the anxious seat propelled the sinner to come forward and begin the change towards righteousness. Finney's most famous sermon was called Niagara Falls, and Niagara Falls did much the same of what the anxious bench did as well. In this sermon, Finney presented a scenario where a man was lost in a deep ravine. The man continued his journey unconscious of danger as he is about to take a fatal step which will surely end with his own destruction. Of course, the only reasonable thing to do is to cry out for the man to stop. Still, the man must choose to heed the words. If he ignores you, he will perish. But if he heeds your words, you are his savior. The word stop rung in the man's ears and caused him to instantly turn away from the precipice. The sermon also expresses Finney's basic theological assumption. The total depravity of man is evidenced through the universal unconscious odyssey near a perilous precipice. Original sin, as such, is not a transmuted pollution, rather the disregard of inherited dangers that exist all around us. Finney's theology was influenced by Jonathan Edwards, Nathan William Taylor, and New Haven theology. Finney's notion of faith is also present in the sermon. The man could not simply assent to the notion of stopping. He actually needed to stop. Continuing would be sin, and like New Haven theology, sin is in the sinning. Your continuing to walk makes it your own fault. Similarly, faith is more than a mental assent to a particular principles. Faith requires action. Faith requires trust that the words are true, and you take action along those lines, similar to what we saw within Edwards and his theology. Unlike many of Finney's more Calvinist cohorts, he believed the call to stop was universal and not limited to the elect only. Finney rejected the Calvinist doctrine of limited atonement. While borrowing a lot from New Haven theology, Finney still rejected the strict Calvinism of the Westminster Confession and created a new school of theology. His attempt was to preserve human agency, much as what we have in New Haven, and thereby reaffirm his faith that something is actually done, right? There's agency still involved. There's a general, not limited atonement, but you have to act upon it. In other words, Finney advocated that God helps those who help themselves. Finney further distanced himself from the Presbyterians with some of the churches that he helped form, including Union Church in New York, which was a free Presbyterian church. Free, for most of the churches in the 19th century, don't talk about the condition of your soul, but actually talk about pew rents. People would usually pay money for their pew. They would rent it. This would be part of your membership tithe, etc. But there became a transactional sort of element. You couldn't just walk in and sit down. The seats were for those members who had paid for them. So your free Presbyterians, much akin to free Methodists and free Baptists, would all be free in that you can go and sit down. In 1832, Finney founded the Broadway Tabernacle. It was a converted theater in New York's Five Points district, the most irreligious population of the city. Here, he preached against the sins of alcohol, slavery, and the Masons. He even refused communion to anyone who owned slaves. Finney also broke with the Presbyterians formally at this time. The church was a Congregationalist church that he founded on the Five Points, not a Presbyterian one. And the Presbyterians were also now a tipping point over the theology of Finney, and the most famous preacher in America was actually facing a real prospect of a heresy trial if he remained with the Presbyterians. So Finney slowly began to distance himself from the Presbyterians and formally separated on March of 1836. Before formally separating from the Presbyterians, in 1832, Finney was involved in the formation of Oberlin College. The school was founded primarily by Asamahan and the Tappan brothers and anti-slave rebels that were expelled from Lane Theological Seminary. It was a school dedicated to teach manual labor skills. Finney, who never graduated from college, served as the head of the theology department. In addition to the innovation of uniting the head, hand, and heart in instruction, the school was revolutionary in its acceptance of blacks and women. Admittance to the school was based upon merit, regardless of color or sex. In 1835, they erected a large tent in the front of a few buildings. The tent could hold 3,000 people and had a large 10-foot blue flag that came from the center pole, and it read, "Holiness to the Lord." The school resembled a big tent meeting, both in its construction and in its content. This was the same year that Finney and others flirted with the concept of retrenchment. The idea was to reject the materialism of the Jacksonian era and to live a minimalist lifestyle. This retrenchment was a retrenchment away from the things of this world and eliminated notions of fancy dress, furniture, and even your diet. The dietary restrictions eliminated all stimulants, including tea, coffee, spices, and tobacco, as well as most meats and grains. In Oberlin, retrenchment diet was largely the work of Sylvester Graham, who inspired the graham cracker. That's where that graham comes from. And nearly entirely consisted of a diet of fruits and vegetables. By the way, Graham's cracker is not the sweet one you have today. He would be rather upset that there's any sugar in it at all, that is too much of a stimulant. Eating fruits, vegetables, and dry, tasteless crackers largely ended up creating new rumors of mass starvation. Finney and Graham were called starvation monarchs, and they were styled as champions of evangelical anorexia. Amidst the experimental retrenchment and evangelical anorexia, Finney's awakening to Christian perfection occurred. This was prompted by Mahan in 1836. Finney, who is often called the father of holiness, converted to the doctrine rather late in his career, alongside his diminishing popularity. Still, his name lent credence to the doctrine of perfection and supported the mother of the holiness movement, Phoebe Palmer, and her notion of holiness. Finney's influence in America waned, and he went off to England in 1849 and in 1859 and held revivals there as well. In 1850, Finney took over for Mahan as the president of Oberlin. After attending church and spending the day with his wife in prayer, he experienced a heart attack and died early on Monday, August 16th in 1875, 2 weeks before his 83rd birthday. While Finney's name is more well known than Phoebe Palmer's, she is really the progenitor of the holiness movement as we see it in America. Palmer also demonstrates more than anyone else the shift in American religion in the early republic. She was born during the presidency of Thomas Jefferson and died during that of Ulysses S. Grant. She lived through foreign invasion with the War of 1812, Manifest Destiny, the Mexican-American War, as well as the Civil War, Reconstruction, and the Gilded Age of antebellum America. This is the context of Palmer declaring, "Names and sects and parties fall, and Christ alone is all in all." While Finney's conversion story begins with his unchurched family, Phoebe Palmer does the opposite. Her father, Henry Worrell, converted to Methodism from Anglicanism in 1785 as a 14-year-old boy when he snuck out of his parents' home to go hear the famous John Wesley's oft-recited sermon on John 3:7, "Ye must be born again." Around age 21, Henry made his way to America and settled in New York, joining the Methodist Episcopal Church. He also at this time met Dorothea Wade, another pious Methodist, and the two quickly married. Their union was a fruitful one. They produced 16 children, 10 boys and 6 girls. Phoebe was their 4th child. Only half of the children reached maturity, though. Phoebe's home was rather pious and also fairly affluent. Other than a single lie she told when she was 3, Phoebe was also rather strict on herself. She was an obedient and devout child, but this also meant that she did not have a conversion experience. For Methodists, as well as the Puritans, Presbyterians, Baptists, and Calvinists, the conversion experience was an emotional experience that grounded the child or adolescent in the faith. It assured them of their salvation, and it marked their entrance into the church more than any sacrament. Phoebe and many children who chose not to rebel against their pious parents find themselves stuck in a sort of limbo, feeling connected to the church but lacking the decisive moment that assured them of their place inside of it. Later, in 1827, Phoebe married Walter Clark Palmer, a rather pious Methodist medical doctor. In September of that same year, Walter was far more pious than his wife. The two of them later on will actually go and preach together, but Phoebe was always the headline. Walter was kind of the backup within all of that. But he was the first one to have a second conversion. It either took place in 1827 or possibly 5 years later. A second conversion is a different concept, one that you might not be familiar with. It is the concept, not a subsequent conversion, right? It is a conversion to a higher level of holiness, and one where the Christian would receive a second blessing. What this second blessing was varied depending on the particular group, but for Walter Palmer, this was a further step in sanctification, sometimes called total sanctification. In the early years, the Palmer marriage, Phebe actually mocked this idea. Still, she was pious and gave birth to 6 children, 3 of which survived. They were also involved in what became known as the Allen Street Methodist Church and began their own set of revivals therein. Phebe was not involved in the Allen Street revival. Rather, her entry into ministry began in her home. Her sister, Sarah Langford, actually began this ministry. The Langfords moved in with the Palmers and began holding weekly meetings dedicated to entire sanctification and the promotion of holiness on Tuesday evenings. A rather long name, not very catchy, wouldn't fit on a marquee, but this is what it became referred to as. Sarah was 19 months older than Phebe and had experienced her second conversion prior to Phebe. This was connected with the Allen Street revival that Walter worked tirelessly with in 1835. Sarah joined a woman's prayer meeting in church that then grew into this Tuesday meeting. On the July of 26th, 1827, Sarah urged her sister to pray and to examine the doctrine of entire sanctification. While Phebe was not really interested in this, in fact, she dismissed it, she did agree to pray. That evening, she did actually experience her second conversion. Though she could never have pointed directly to any first conversion experience, she did have this second conversion one. Phebe then shared in the Tuesday meetings, and before too long, supplanted her older sister as the group's head. The Tuesday meetings were rather large. They actually, well, referred to as Tuesday meeting, most of us are thinking it's something that's going to be in the evening. They began at 2:30 in the afternoon and would stretch all the way into the evening. And it would begin with readings from sections of the Bible. From here, the congregation sung and prayed. After this, someone chose to speak on the scripture reading, but the speaker varied and their exposition was rather short. Following this, people gave testimonies about their conversion experience or their encounters with God since the last time they gathered the week before, and sometimes audience would come in and go out. In many ways, this actually resembled Quaker services as much as it did a Methodist church service. 2 noticeable distinctions were obvious. First, it took place in a home rather than a church. The first is that it took place at home rather than a church. Second, while clergy were often present, they didn't run the meeting. They were just there. The meetings were far more social than a religious gathering in some respects, and one person might pray, then another, without following any sort of strict liturgical formula. In many ways, again, this looks more Quaker than Methodist. Freedom permeated the service for those who prayed, to what songs were being sung, to what topic would actually be addressed. Under Phoebe's leadership, these meetings included an altar call, so to speak. She gave those who attended an opportunity to repent, convert, or accept total sanctification. In this altar call, there was no altar, and a large crowd present who pressed the uninitiated towards the entire sanctification was the no norm. These meetings lasted for over 50 years. There were over 2,500 Tuesday meetings for the promotion of holiness. Each meeting averaged 200 participants. The Palmers actually moved twice to accommodate the growing groups. The meetings also grew to allow men, and they were interdenominational. While the Campbellites and Landmark Baptists were restricting who could join, Phoebe opened her group up. The first man to attend the meeting was Thomas Cogswell Upman. Upman's wife invited him to the meeting in 1839. Upman was a professor at Bowdoin College in Maine, and he was a Congregationalist interested in the concept of holiness. Palmer wrote that in addition to Methodists, her home was visited by lay and clergy members that were Baptists, Congregationalists, Dutch Reformed, German Reformed, Presbyterians, Protestant Episcopalians, Quakers, Minted Brethren, and Jews in Christ. In addition to the Tuesday meetings, Phoebe was asked to lead a young converts class at Allen Street in 1839. She accepted this, becoming the first woman in New York appointed to permanently lead a mixed class meeting. Phoebe Palmer began to travel to other churches, spreading her message of entire sanctification. Both Phoebe and Walter Palmer became full-time Methodist evangelists. Walter continued his medical practice, often linking these two practices together. The Palmers were two of the four noteworthy Methodist evangelists before the mid-1850s. The other two were ordained and foreign-born John Newland Maffitt and James Coffey, Maffitt dying in 1850, Coffey in 1891. Phoebe's perfectionist message was simple and simply done. She took what was happening on her Tuesday afternoons and did the same thing elsewhere. This was a basic pattern of evangelism, and it emphasized experience over creeds. So most Protestant denominations accepted her. Often her sermons consisted of stories of conversion experiences rather than much, if any, theological prose. With such success preaching, Phoebe desired to reach an even greater audience. The press was a perfect place for this. She began publishing accounts of her views of salvation in the Christian Advocate and Journal in 1842. Through the journal, she constructed her first published work, The Way of Holiness, in 1843. This book quickly became a bestseller amongst devotional works. The work underwent several editions and was translated into French, where it sold 1,600 copies. It was also translated into German, and versions existed in Liberia and Siam. But not much was done with these. They weren't very successful in these other areas. The work's greatest success was in English-speaking countries, as one would naturally expect, in the United States, Canada, and England. Worldwide, it sold more than 100,000 copies during her lifetime. More remarkable than its success was her choice to let her name appear on the title page. Many women during this period used pseudonyms, especially when writing devotional or theological works. Her choice not to do so adds significant weight to the argument that she was an early feminist. It was also a good move for her evangelical career. The success of her work only made her more popular and opened new areas for her to speak and advocate entire sanctification. The Way of Holiness was followed by An Entire Devotion to God in 1845, Faith and Its Effects in 1848. These works make up the core of her theological notion of the altar theology. These three works are also modeled after her sermons. They are filled with stories of conversions and accounts of her own life and her struggles with faith. None of these works are a systematic theology of the Christian faith, though. They are primarily devotional aids that reveal her theology and are not overtly theological. Palmer's most theological work, The Promise of Our Father, was published in 1859, is also her most controversial. In this work, Palmer sets out her justification as a woman to speak in church. This is the only work where Phoebe moves beyond personal testimonies and Bible quotes and uses arguments from history and biblical criticism. Phoebe preached throughout New York City, then the state, then New Jersey. And by request, she then preached in Pennsylvania to a group of Moravians, not Methodists. Then other denominations made similar requests. She then preached in Boston. She was also responsible for the famed 5 Points mission in New York, similar to what was happening with Finney, but hers was entirely separate. Seemingly everywhere she and her husband went, they found great success until 1848. As the holiness message grew, some people saw it as an opportunity to get their name out and to join in as holiness preachers. As such, clergy both inside and outside of Methodism began to criticize the movement as a whole. To combat this and defend her ministry, Phoebe Palmer wrote incidental illustrations in 1855. The greatest onslaught of attacks actually took place in the 1850s and played out in the Christian Advocate and Journal, the very same work that in the previous decade Phoebe Palmer got her literary experience started. Hiram Madison was the chief opponent of Palmer. Madison was a Methodist elder and professor of astronomy and natural philosophy at Fayette Seminary in upstate New York. Madison believed that Palmer's teachings were divisive and filled with errors. He spelled out 8 propositions which he believed illustrated the errors of Palmer's theology in public for all to see. Madison's judgment of holiness had some lasting repercussions. Anti-holiness sentiment grew, and eventually Methodist evangelists were subjected to ecclesial oversight if they held meetings without approval by a list of clergy who often disapproved of holiness teachings. By the 1880s, those who supported the doctrine of holiness created an independent National Association of Holiness, the National Holiness Association, and this led to denominations such as the Church of the Nazarene and later on the Pentecostals. In part to circumvent the increased ecclesial oversight and the growing anti-holiness sentiments that existed within the Methodist Church, Phoebe Palmer started to use the technology of the day. That is, she moved outside. And we had the camp meetings similar to what we would see in Kentucky and those done by Finney in the west of New York, as well as Ohio and the rest of the United States. Palmer herself held meetings throughout the United States and Canada in the 1850s, and these met with great success. Overall, this holiness message and camp meetings had a lot of success, and a lot of that paid dividends for the Methodists. And throughout the 1840s and 50s, Methodism was steadily growing about 20,000 members every year. In 1850, that number jumped up to 136,036 members. We know at least 2,000 of those that year came from Phoebe Palmer's meetings directly. This year was referred to as Methodists as the Year of Miracles, Annus Mirabilis. Palmer's meetings were interdenominational, though, at this point, and many of her followers actually returned to their own denomination. It didn't matter if they were Baptist, Campbellite, Presbyterian, or some other group. Camp meeting associations ended up growing up within the Methodist Episcopal Church, and it ended up purchasing locations for these camps. People would keep coming back to these camps for revival every year, so they just set them up as permanent establishments. By 1856, the camps, though, started to lose their tents. They were no longer outdoor tent, semi-sporadic meetings. Permanent cottages would also be set up. After the Civil War, these cottages actually resembled middle-class resort communities, including streets that radiated from an outdoor auditorium. A decade after the Civil War concluded, campsites, famous ones that you might be familiar with, such as Martha's Vineyard in Ocean Grove, New Jersey, began to lose their religious identity to tourism. And the revival sites then became vacation destinations. By the end of the century, there were less and less revivals there, and even the prohibition against alcohol disappeared. Right before the outbreak of the Civil War, the Palmers left for their voyage to England. The Palmers will spend 4 years in the British Isles between 1859 and 1863, spreading the holiness message there. Overall, they found a good amount of success, but ran into difficulties over their stance on alcohol and their prohibition thereof. They also spent time in Ireland and Scotland and considered going to France, but since they didn't speak French, they didn't. It is on one of her camp meetings that Phoebe Palmer possibly met Queen Victoria. Here, the Queen was on the Isle of Wight, and the two possibly encountered one another. It's said at this point that Phoebe Palmer gave the Queen her book, The Promise of the Father, and here Palmer was not able to hand her a copy of the book directly, but was told by a private secretary that the Queen did receive it, and Phoebe did receive a letter back from the Queen thanking her for the book. When the Palmers returned home to New York from overseas, they bought the magazine The Guide for Christian Perfection. Phoebe then purchased The Beauty of Holiness and Sabbath Miscellany, two other holiness publications, and merged these three magazines together. By doing so, she essentially purchased the major holiness magazines that existed in America, eliminating nearly all, if not all, of the competition, and adding a good number of subscribers to her publications. She ended up growing this publication to become the largest religious newspaper in the country during the 1860s, and really kind of all the way until the end of the 19th century. After she returned from England, she also continued her camp meetings, but now throughout the entirety of the United States, including the West. We have records of her camp meetings and her migration all the way into Lawrence, Kansas, and then Sacramento, where she had a meeting that lasted 2 weeks, San Francisco, and several other cities in Northern California. On her return, she did stop by in Utah. No meeting was held in Utah. After a gathering of some Mormon women, she roundly condemned Mormonism and the practice of polygamy while she was there. From here, she went to Oberlin and actually stayed with Finney. Phoebe continued preaching at camp meetings until her death in 1874. In total, she preached over 140 different meetings and revivals after her return from England in 1863, all without receiving any pay. Her magazine actually financed the revivals. The Guide continued until 1901, largely as a family publication. Palmer's basic theological message concerns holiness or Christian perfection as understood from a Methodist lens. John Wesley wrote extensively on the subject, but was always ambiguous enough to leave his doctrine incomplete or enough wiggle room so it could be accepted by a greater audience. His doctrine of Christian perfection grew from his belief that Christians could simply choose not to sin. Therefore, they needed to be perfect or they weren't really Christians. This perfection is the second conversion talked about by Palmer and others. Palmer's central theological contribution was to develop and to complete Wesley's theology. She did so by removing the ecclesial and theological limitations that Wesley sought to maintain as a good Anglican. Palmer's conception of perfection falls under her concept of the shorter way, which includes full consecration or her altar theology. There are three essential steps to Palmer's shorter way. The first is the altar. The second is faith that the act was actually done. And the third is testimony. The entire shorter way is subsumed under the idea of the Christian altar. For Palmer, this is not an altar where the Eucharistic sacrament is performed. There is no separate priest that ministers to the altar either. For Palmer, the altar is Christ himself. The Christian is the gift now. The Christian must figuratively lay themselves upon the altar of Christ. Palmer asserts, we have an altar. This altar is Christ. His blood is the purifying medium. With Christ as the altar, anything that touches Christ is automatically made holy. It is made clean by his presence. God made Christ the altar and commands the Christian to come to it by faith, laying everything on the altar thus making everything holy. The Christian is therefore the living sacrifice, laying their entire being upon this altar. This is an act of faith and an act of surrendering one's will to Christ. Under the Old Covenant, the animal was placed upon the altar and was sacrificed. Therefore, the Christian presenting themselves on the altar is sacrificing themselves, that is, their will. In this act, they receive Christ's will, and Christ's holiness is then swapped for theirs. There's this notion of transmuted righteousness, but now it's through a swapping of a will. Once the self has been offered on the altar, which is Christ, the Christian must now believe that they are now sanctified. Faith in the completed act of sanctification is the second step. This is where salvation is done by faith and holding with that doctrine amongst Protestants. In the same moment as this sort of offertory act, the Christian must believe that they are entirely sanctified. The necessity of actions is as a result of faith becomes the third step in Palmer's shorter way. The sanctified Christian must testify publicly about their salvation. If they do not, then it can be lost. Proclaiming their own salvation gives honor to Christ. To remain silent is a sin and an act of rebellion from the very God who just saved you, illustrating that the faith was false or at best incomplete, that you were never truly placed your entire will upon the altar. Withholding anything, you are now lost, just as Ananias and Sapphira in the book of Acts. God grants the blessing of sanctification not for the believer's enjoyment alone, but for all who hear and accept this avenue of salvation. Just like Wesley, Palmer believes that perfection can be lost. The primary way sanctification is lost for Palmer is a rejection of this third step. What we see in a lot of Phoebe Palmer's shorter way is the culmination of a lot of the theology of the first and second Great Awakening, as well as many of those theological tenets from Calvinism and Luther in the early Reformation period. Phoebe Palmer is also very much a product of the second Great Awakening and the Holiness movement, akin to what was done by Finney and others. She wanted to make people to have a decision very, very quickly. You have to make the decision now, just as we had with the anxious seat. Phoebe Palmer starts to add to this same sort of idea. Why? Because the shorter way is short because it's accessible. It is here and it is at this moment that you can lay everything down. You don't need to actually be at a place with an altar to be able to have this conversion experience, is what Phoebe Palmer would argue. There are no catechumen classes, but only an immediate call to action. She had a few added techniques to also help encourage other people to make this decision. First, she urged and used group pressure whenever possible. She understood notions of group psychology, that if you were confused or unsure, having others around you to help push you into this right direction would be what would call this moment. Therefore, the pressure and the life of the tent revival became a means of the altar itself. While you could do this alone, usually it is done by other people around you. She also encouraged everyone to stand up to present themselves as candidates. She knew that this physical act of standing up would make you more likely to come forward than it would be if you remained sitting. When you stand up, you've already taken a step, and once you've taken one, it's a lot easier to move forward. So this becomes the way to come up front, to go ahead and pray and to lay down your entire will upon the altar, which is Christ, not a physical altar being present during these tent revivals. It is also when you're standing that you're going to feel peer pressure all the more that you ought to move forward instead of staying present. Phoebe Palmer's preaching was very effective. Another reason for her effectiveness was that, unlike other revivals, she emphasized lay ministry. This created larger networks to keep the newly sanctified sanctified. They had other people who were not clergy that she would send them out to, that would encourage them and surround them into this new life of holiness. Palmer's second significant theological contribution concerned the role of women in feminist theology. Palmer's feminist theology was simultaneously countercultural and also fairly consistent within pietism, especially the pietism expressed by Wesley and his followers. For most of 19th century American life, especially in the North, women were relegated to a separate sphere. Gender relations were distinct and possessed a rigid sort of gender division of labor. This division of labor gave women primacy over the domestic sphere, while men controlled nearly everything else. Church life was an interesting area where women were celebrated for superior virtue and piety, while also isolated from many of the positions that virtue and piety were naturally inclined to adopt. Palmer's feminism focused on women's participation in the church. John Wesley allowed for women to teach Bible classes and even to preach. One notable example is Sarah Crosby. Her involvement with Wesley is rather suspicious, at least it was to Wesley's wife. But so too were also a number of other women who Wesley seemed to prefer to keep their company of instead of that of his wife, such as Sarah Ryan and possibly also Mrs. Lefevre and Betty Design. John Wesley's connection with some of his acolytes even led his wife and others to conclude that he had a series of affairs. While the affairs were never confirmed, Wesley's extra time spent with Sarah Crosby unequivocally led to her prominent position within Wesley's inner circle. In 1761, Crosby led a class in London and was sent to teach other classes as well. This included mixed classes. Not only did she instruct women, but she instructed men as well in the faith. She also gave sermons, and though sermon advised, her sermons did not resemble the traditional sermon in its construction. They were supposed to be a little more pastoral than theological in nature. Lay preachers were necessary for Wesley and for Methodism following him. And since the majority of Methodists in the UK and the US were women, actually, having women teach seemed reasonable, especially in the context of Sunday school classes, leading the band, those in the medical field, including nurses and visitors for the sick. Women had a very prominent and important role for Methodists in both the United States and in the UK. It should be no surprise then that early 19th century America was actually filled with women preachers who spread Methodism and other forms of Protestantism. There were over 100 itinerant female preachers active during the first half of the 19th century, and roughly a quarter of them were Methodists. Following Crosby's example, women's preaching styles differed from men. The feminine style was often more successful in generating converts, and women generally had a calm demeanor that carried over in their preaching. After a decade of preaching, Palmer ended up writing her famed work, The Promise of the Father, a neglected specialty of the last days, in 1859. This work spells out her concerns for women in the 19th century. Palmer's concerned herself with three distinct areas in this, her last and greatest work. First, Palmer seeks to elevate the position of women, which she believes was demeaned during the first half of the century. Second, she wants to address the prohibition against women preaching. This is the bulk of the work, and she points to examples of prominent women in the Bible and Christian tradition. Special attention is paid to the role of women during Pentecost. One side note here, who she doesn't actually talk about is the Virgin Mary. Finally, she tries to understand Paul's command for women to keep silent in the church. This becomes her sort of three-pronged theological instead of just holiness-driven reason why women ought to be allowed to preach in church. What Phoebe Palmer's work, The Promise of the Father, did was open up the floodgates. The result of Palmer's work made it possible for a lot of women in America and then later elsewhere to start to seek ordination, first within Methodism and then elsewhere. Palmer herself actually did not seek ordination or ecclesial office. Neither would have changed what she did. Other Methodist women who came later, though, did benefit from Palmer's work. In 1866, Eleanor Davidson was the first woman ordained within Methodism to the diaconate. In 1880, Anna Howard Shaw was ordained to the diaconate. A few years later, Ella Niswonger was the first woman to graduate from the denomination's seminary and to be ordained. In 1869, Isabella Thorburn and Dr. Clara Swain were the first single missionaries. Women's involvement in missions grew to the point that in 1910, more than half of Protestant missionaries were women. Palmer's feminist message reached many who were crucial for the development of early feminism, including Martha Wheat, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Frances Willard, Hannah Whitehall Smith, all of which serve as examples of women who were impacted by Palmer's life and her works. Famously, Harriet Beecher Stowe, the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, was reared on Calvinism and revivalism. The Beecher family were well acquainted with the Palmers, and Phoebe publicly criticized Harriet's brother, the Reverend Henry Ward Beecher, for his inclusion of bowling alleys in the Brooklyn YMCA. Frances Willard, the leader of the Women's Temperance Union, was also influenced by Palmer. The WTL was the largest American women's organization, having 176,000 members by the close of the century. Phoebe Palmer was the first mainstream woman widely known as a religious leader in America. A few other women may have predated her, but not among mainstream Protestantism. Charles White estimates that over 1.5 million people converted to holiness while she was in England, and more than that in the United States. Her books and magazines were top sellers in religious literature, more than many of the names that are far more familiar to us today. Not surprisingly, she was widely accepted as the mother of the Holiness movement at the time of her death in 1874. Yet, within a generation of her passing, she was all but lost to history and to a great number of scholars. Her holiness theology continued, and her experiential Protestantism survived into the 20th century, becoming the basis for both fundamentalism and Pentecostals. Only a few scholars have recognized her importance, and not only in holiness, but also in the camp movement, ecumenical movement, missionary movement, inner city, domestic, and international movements, women's suffrage, and the temperance movement. America in the 19th century belonged to the Methodists first, the Baptists second, and the Catholics third. Methodism's early years in America did not look promising, beginning with Wesley's ill-fated journey to America, where he almost died at sea, and then later him leaving through the swamps of Georgia as a fugitive. Further issues arose, including Wesley and Whitfield's continued clash over the issue of slavery. At the founding of the country, there were roughly 14,000 Methodists. This number grew to over 600,000 by 1833 and over 1 million by 1845. The growth of Methodism in the 19th century baffles the mind. Many will refer to this as the Methodist miracle. The percentage of Americans affiliated with a denomination rose from 2.5% in 1776 to 34.2% in 1850. Methodists also lacked any way of adequately training their preachers, though, at this period, aside from reading just published accounts. There were no formal requirement for education prior to 1816 General Conference. Even after this conference, there were no Methodist schools until 1850. All of this growth took place outside of what would be seen as a normal establishment way. Unfortunately, there was not even a set list of books, though, and preachers were often ill-prepared, but they were ready to go out. They were people who were properly trained for the frontier in that they were already somewhat frontiersmen themselves. Methodist doctrine was not clearly identified until the mid-century. This growth was so great, though, that in 1868, President Ulysses S. Grant jested that in America there were three political parties. Sorry, Whigs, you're not among them. He was referring to the Republicans, the Democrats, and the Methodist Church. Both Grant and his successor, Rutherford B. Hayes, were Methodists. While Grant extolled the success of Methodism, in 1868 it was already over a decade into its downfall. Methodism peaked at about 11.7% of the total population. Remember that number earlier of 34.2 was those who attended church, and church rates are still not as high as one might imagine. By 1890, the percentage dropped from 11.7 to 11.4%, and then below 10% of the population by 1950, and by 1980, Methodists make up less than 7.5% of the population. What accounted for the rise and what accounted for the fall might actually be the same thing. There are many people who point to the fact that Methodists were a frontier religion. They could get up and go and preach on a circuit, but then tents turn into buildings, buildings turn into established theology, new schools are formed, more training is needed. The cost of entry to become a new Methodist preacher is more and more, and this very same pattern that allowed for its growth is also what then ends up making the church more stagnant and fragmentary. What we've seen is that the holiness message was challenged both inside and outside the denominations that they found themselves within. Methodism, the main home for the holiness message, ended up having many who pushed back against it. Finney, who started off as a Presbyterian, was pushed outside of the Presbyterian fold, moved himself into a Congregationalist, and kind of became his own thing later on as a holiness preacher, in many ways separated from any established denomination. Many of the critiques of holiness are as old as the country, largely following under the title of enthusiasm that we saw early on with those who didn't like the movements of the First Great Awakening. The Presbyterian General Assembly of 1798 railed against the impiety of the once dominant denominations and the success of the upstarts such as the Baptists and the Methodists. Today, Baptists and Methodists are understood to be kind of foundational, normal, generic Christian expressions in America, and yet they were seen as the radical ones here in the beginning of the 19th century. A lot can change, both in one end and the other. Princeton Seminary was actually on the front lines of anti-revivalism. The school sought to undermine Finney. Finney himself saw the falling of many revivals and the failings that were there and the backsliding of so many different converts and lamented this. The push from both Princeton Calvinists and Finney was the promotion of moralism by the middle of the century. It was at this point that the term Puritan actually grew in its modern pejorative. Afterwards, the Puritan involvement in both Great Awakenings is challenged and was seen as just moralism. And there's no real way of putting the genie back into the bottle. The Calvinists had some success in their anti-revivalism along the seaboard, but it was not strong enough to match the fervor found in the rest of the country, especially in those areas that were less settled in those frontier regions. The Atlantic was attempting to cool the fires of the frontier, but the fanaticism flames grew higher. The enthusiasm gap was too large. The only way to overcome this was to denounce Christian liberty with legalism. The best example of this took place with the Presbyterian Synod of 1837, which sided with the Congregationalists rather than with the Finneyite. The result was that the Calvinist Presbyterians broke ties with 45% of their congregations. Much of the movement and machinations of the 19th century is an attempt to reconcile both establishment ideas and frontier ideology. It's to keep moralism and holiness without necessarily the revivalism and yet this was not easily done or could be accomplished. Some final thoughts. Both Finney and Palmer used psychological techniques to convert people over to holiness. In what way do psychological sales pitches work? Obviously, people are moved towards action, but as Finney himself noticed, people might flare up and then go away. They might not go home with the new convictions that they had just faced. And is it appropriate to treat the gospel as a sales pitch? Is that what it is amongst everything else? Is it a product that you're selling? Finney also founded Oberlin, and it's also should be noted that the Methodists founded a number of universities throughout the 19th century. Do you think that these helped or hindered the holiness message? What do you think would make them work better? Obviously, Oberlin had a giant 10-foot banner saying holiness to the Lord. It was a holiness university, though not many would associate Oberlin with religious piety today. Also, what do you think about the relative low barrier to entry to become a holiness preacher? No ordination was needed, no building. Camp meetings were common. Sometimes you can just go on out and find an open field and start preaching, and others would surround you and be a part of that. Also, like many of the other movements that both flourished and died in the 19th century, the American holiness movement was a success. But why wasn't it a success? And why could it not remain within the established denominations? Why did it have to become a new movement and not simply a revival of Methodism or Presbyterianism?